Good evening, folks. I'm Ed Childs, Director of Assessing. My charge tonight is to talk about demographic and financial facts. As a background, I've been here, it'll be 30 years in February. One of the things that I constantly hear from our citizens is how high our taxes are. A lot of times the tax rate is an instrument that's thrown out compared to the other Cape towns. I'm here tonight to break that down a little bit to basically show, first of all, why tax rates really should not be used as a tool of comparison. Why Sandwich is so demographically different from all the other Cape communities. Really, our one main similarity is geographic. We all happen to be on this peninsula called Cape Cod. I'm going to talk about two tools of what I call absorption of taxes. One is non-resident ownership, and one is high-end residential value. And a lot of times these two work hand in hand to demonstrate a whole different pattern of tax load for the other Cape towns versus Sandwich. We're also going to show a general comparison that reveals more similarities to several Plymouth and Bristol County towns because they, like we are a year-round full-time town. We're going to show that the commercial, industrial, personal property share is not as bare as popular thought and claims are. And we're going to show that more to be in a year-round town, the need is there and real for segments such as education. We will show graphically where we have just a heavier load. And none of this is in the way of justification, but in the way of explanation of where we stand. Next slide. First, we're going to talk about average tax bill versus tax rate. Tax rates are not a valid comparison. In short, a tax rate or tax levy is the amount of money that a town has to raise through taxation after other revenue sources have been exhausted. So you take a total budget that's been approved at town meeting, you subtract from it other fees, whether it be state funding, our local fees such as excise or permit fees, and you're left with an amount that has to fall within the limits of Proposition 2.5 that we'll raise through taxation. At the same time, we're setting property value as assessed value. By law, that is a market expression of valuation as of January 1st of the prior calendar year to the fiscal year. So these two processes take place independently. When it comes to doing a tax rate, you're just simply dividing the value into the levy, multiplying by 1,000, and you get a rate. So the rate just works as a mechanism at the end of two independent processes. The best example I can give you as to where the idea of a rate examination, like I've had people say to me all the time, the rate goes up because values go up, or the rate goes down, and it's totally inverse from that thought. When Prop 2.5 went through, I was working in Barnstable as an assistant at the time, and all Cape towns revalued. This is 1982. In Barnstable, for example, the values tripled. The levy went up about 3.5%. So the rate dropped dramatically, and the bills went up by about 3.5%. So what happens here basically is the values will move up, the rate will drop, you're going to pay based off the movement of the levy. The values go down, the rate goes up, you're going to pay more based off the value of the levy. Next. We're going to start digging right into some comparisons. First, you have the average tax bill. In everybody but Sandwich, it's in red. In Sandwich, it's in green. The blue is taking the total levy for fiscal 17 and dividing by the total population based off the 2013 census. While Sandwich ranks second highest, this is still a more equitable comparison because it accounts for the fact that you have others, such as non-residents, that are paying in and not deriving the service opportunity that a year-round resident would have. You also account for this to some degree in terms of high-end residential value, which works like commercial, industrial, personal property, that it pays in and absorbs from the center. In other words, from the average bill, it takes more away because they're paying at a higher rate. And in a lot of cases, these are also non-residents, so they're not deriving the services. These two things sometimes couple together. Sometimes it's more on one part of it or the other, but in the combination of the two, what you're going to find is, look at a town like Truro, where it's about 70% second homes, and you've got more people paying in to the pool. So it might be a town of a population of 2,000, but it's being paid for like it's a population of 6,000 to 8,000. So there's more absorption. Next, please. And this just takes the expenditure per resident, absent of the average tax bill. Just another way to look at it. But you'll see that it's not excessive compared to the other towns, where a lot of people in talks in my office have said that it is. Next. Now we selected Kingston, Bridgewater, Middleborough, Marshfield, Plymouth, and Situate. There are a lot of different reasons why you pull up selections. I can tell you a lot of the things that we matched up to here, we have no match like that in Barnstable County. So these are actually closer to how we model financially. And you can see by this graph here, population-wise, you can see in towns that have not as high a second home percentage as the Cape Towns, and some high-end valuation, but not on a percentage basis as the other Cape Towns, we model in a much more similar fashion between the cost per resident and the average tax bill. Once again, this shows the South Shore just for the population. And I'll get to a little bit more later as to why Middleborough and Bridgewater would differ, but it's fairly similar otherwise. Next. This is where we start digging into second home percentage, and this is very meaningful. 16% of our properties residentially are owned by non-residents. In a typical fashion, some of them are rented year-round, but in a typical fashion, they're deriving 10 to 12 weeks of potential service, not including school. The next lowest is Bourne, but I'll show later that there's another part of the two things I talked about today, which is the high-end residential, that takes Bourne out of a comparison. The rest of them, you're talking 40% or higher. Once again, the idea of absorption. 47% of your residential payers in Barnstable are not full-time residents of Barnstable, but they're paying as if they were, because it's not a menu choice. They pay on the same rate, the same bill. Next. Just as a look, we took all of the non-resident homeowner towns as a count, and each community's share of them for the Cape. As you can see, by far, with the exception of Bourne, we are lower by a factor of 3 to 4 to the other towns. Couple this with the fact, this graph stunned me. I knew it was out there. I knew that there was another factor other than second homes that would show why there is this differential. These are residential properties over $1 million in value for fiscal 17. Their count is in the bar in white and the total. And you can see here we have 122 properties with a total value of $167 million. By contrast, Chatham, 1,910 properties represent a total value that's higher than our total assessed value for fiscal 17. What does this represent? Once again, absorption, bang for the buck. High-end residential, which for the most part is also second home, paying in and not deriving the service need. Once again, we took it on a value basis this time on a pie chart. And you can see that little sliver is sandwiched. Now, this is not to knock us as a residential value. There are two key reasons why we model different than the other Cape towns. Number one is warm water coastline. We do not have any. Many of the other communities have it. For example, I grew up in Barnstable, Oyster Harbor's 300 properties right now at a present average assessment of $20 million. Works in the same way as commercial, industrial, and personal property. Bang for the buck. They're paying in, not deriving nearly the amount of services. The second thing is a true summer community. When you get out to the arm of the Cape, you have that old feel, you have, whether you're on the bay side or the ocean side, you've got high-end residential sales. I mean, asking prices from, say, Truro on up usually start just under $1 million up. And that's for any property. So when you have that type of contribution without the utility of services, it's meaningful on how it can impact the typical tax bill downward. Next. So we wanted to have a quick discussion about commercial, industrial, and personal property. There has been discussion that we don't have enough, and I wouldn't disagree with that. As an assessor, any good commercial, industrial, personal property additions we can make to our tax base are great because they represent the things I'm talking about. Input of income without as high a use of services. But a lot of conversations that we have none on a percentage basis. This chart shows clearly that we do. As a matter of fact, we're fourth, and a lot of people focus on what they consider the main economic seat, which is Barnstable. We are just under 0.5% different in that share. Next. And here's really where this whole discussion of absorption, where the rubber hits the road. The blue represents the commercial, industrial, and personal property share, yellow in Sandwich's case. The red represents the percentage share of $1 million plus residential properties compared to the entire town value. So you end up with percentages like Chatham, 68% of their levy is taken from either commercial, industrial, personal property or $1 million plus residential. And you can see on this whole graph, this red area is significant. And in doing the research on it, and this information, by the way, came from each assessor's office. And where it's significant is that it just builds up the share on, in most cases, triple or more, Chatham, 8 times the commercial industrial impact. Nothing speaks more to the impact of this and how it converts to a big rate differential in a big average tax bill than this part, the red part. Because you see on ours, it's 4.28%. Now, some look a little bit closer, like at Eastham, but we can explain this by, remember, this part doesn't even take into account second homes. So once you add that layer in, that provides more separation. To me, this was the most meaningful of all the graphs. I personally, in putting that together, was floored by the amount of differential. Now, to further the idea about our existing commercial industrial, if Unit 3, which is under agreement, when that agreement went through at a valuation that leads to a first payment. If we add that valuation as a percentage to our current percentage, we would be the highest and 5% above the town considered to be the commercial seat. So we are trying to do our due diligence of the town. We should all feel good that we're making these efforts to keep that share going. Next. This is compared to the towns that I'd cited off, Cape. You can see that Plymouth and Middleborough modeled closer to 21%. They do have a much higher commercial presence. So for these towns, it works to help them in lieu of having as much on a percentage basis high-end residential. And then the other towns are fairly similar. Next. And even in this scenario, adding Unit 3, we model very closely to even those two towns. So, like I had stated, to restate, a lot of times we hear that we don't have commercial properties and we do not support economic development. I don't believe that is true. I believe that the facts bear out. You know, you always can welcome more. If it meets all the tests and can be here, great. But right now, we're in the top 4 in terms of percentage. And once again, very close to Barnstable. And if Unit 3 comes online, we'll be the highest on the Cape. So I believe that we're showing responsibility as town leaders and boards for supporting commercial development where possible. And any statements to the contrary just don't seem to hold true statistically. The next thing is, and these stats came from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. This is the pre-K through 12 count by town. What's significant here is and probably expected, we're third in the list. Barnstable obviously is in the lead. Falmouth next, and then Sandwich. But the difference here, if you think back to the other graphs that I've shown, is that in share, we're more of a full-time, year-round town. So it has to come from the core. We have, most of our taxpayers are around a central. So the core has to come from more around the average to support this. And it's a high count. And this is all of the local, regional, technical, and charter school. It does not account for any private or homeschool. Now, the more telling thing is when you convert it to a percentage by taking this count and dividing it by the 2013 population for each town, and that's next slide, please. You can see on a percentage basis we're the highest. It's impactful. The #1 business of a town is to educate, and it comes with it that cost. Next, please. Now we examine it by the OffCape examples they gave you, and they model pretty closely. Obviously, Plymouth is a huge town. But the interesting thing is, if you look at the next slide, look at it on a percentage basis to their total population. We're higher. And the other towns, a couple of the other smaller towns actually modeled higher than us, but they're within about 2%. Next, please. So for our own town, breaking down our costs, this graph shows of our total budget, the school-related costs at 64%, the general government costs at 29%, and the general costs at 7%. Now, this year has been relatively stable over the last few years, but the next graph is going to show you an inherent business model problem with funding education. There is a regular statement, and I hear it in my office, being the assessor, and you know, at abatement time, the happy folks come by and talk to me about not usually their value, but their tax bill, and we have to explain that we talk about value in our office. But they'll say, I don't get anything for my taxes. And a lot of times when the conversation gets more involved, I'll ask about if they have children in the school system. And in that one item alone, particularly, they get something for their taxes. The per pupil expenditure amount for fiscal 16 is $15,628. The average tax bill was $52.76. Now, if you take these two numbers on a straight line basis for 13 years, and straight line means I didn't adjust either that number or that number. And they both could be adjusted upward. The total cost to educate is $203,164. The direct payment from that one average tax bill for that one child would represent 34% of the total cost, or $68,000. So as a business model, we're starting 66% behind. It gets made up by all other sources. It amounts to $134,615 over the course of 13 years. If you take that at the average bill, it would take 25.5 years to recapture that money. For 2 children, it goes to 64, for 3 to 102. Not the most promising business model if you were a private business and had that plan presented to you. But this is the reality of what we have. Once again, on a straight line basis. But this is our obligation as a community, right? An entire community provides education, as well as public safety, DPW, financial, administrative, inspectional, health, recreation, and other services. It's the core of what we do. So at this time, I'd like to turn over discussion and presentation on exempt debt to Bud Dunham.